Welcome everybody to our first Learning Our Landscape presentation of the 2022 year. We're super excited to be bringing you this series where we're going to be looking at taking a more holistic approach to understanding the North Olympic Peninsula landscape using both Western science, traditional ecological knowledge, and a bunch of different facets to try and give people just a better understanding of this amazing landscape that we live on and its history. All right, so today we're going to be reviewing the Squim ethnography and ethnobotany of the Sequim-Dungeness Valley. For those of you who tuned into some of our TIPO talks last year, we did touch on different facets of the ethnography and ethnobotany of the Sequim-Dungeness Valley, but hoping to take a broader approach and then dive into more details in terms of the specific plants, what they're used for, where they were located, et cetera. The background image on this first slide is actually a picture from the Sporeseen Prairie, which is on the south side of Squim, and was sort of the southernmost of the Squim Prairies, just south of Silverhorn Road in Squim. So, quick disclaimer, I am not a medical professional. I am a historian. Do not go out and try and eat or use any of these plants that I'm talking about today for medicine. Without a traditional cultural practitioner, many of these plants can actually cause illness or even death. A lot of these plants are very similar to other plants that are quite poisonous. So all that said, just please don't go out and eat a bunch of these plants after I give the presentation. A little bit of background, ethnobotany is the study of a region's plants and their practical uses through the traditional knowledge of a local culture and people. That's different from ethnography, which is a branch of anthropology. And ethnography looks at cultural phenomena through the perspective of the subject of study, in this case, the Squam people. So I made this map a couple years ago, and this is just based off of the 1850s General Land Office surveys. So back in the 1850s, when Washington was still a territory, the federal government sent out surveyors to essentially map the landscape in order that it could eventually be divvied up and apportioned and sold off and sort of how we ended up with the landscape that we're on today. But the areas that are highlighted in red are actually the different Olympic Peninsula rain shadow prairies. So you can see that going beyond Squim to the east, there's actually quite a number of prairies on the Squim Peninsula. They're on Protection Island. Over on Whidbey Island, you've got the Smith Prairie, Eby's Prairie, which were both also used by the Squam people for harvesting plant stuffs. And if this map was zoomed out a little bit farther, you'd see that also the San Juan Islands in the south end of Victoria or Vancouver Island also had extensive rain shadow prairies, and those were also used by the Squam people. The areas highlighted in blue, and I only focused on the area around the Dungeness River here, but the areas that I've highlighted in blue are actually the wetlands that were mapped in those 1850 land surveys. So the first thing I want to do is examine what exactly the Squim Prairie was. So typically what's used in historic sources is the term Squim Prairie, which doesn't really make much sense when you look at the GLO land survey maps, because you've actually got roughly 10 prairies around the Sequim-Dungeness area. The reason for that is because when the GLO land survey office mapped prairies, what they simply did was outline areas where it was strictly grasslands and there were really no trees growing. But from the perspective of examining the landscape, the Squim Prairies actually went far beyond those little red blobs. So, you know, within those red outlines, those would have been almost strictly grasslands. But then outside of that would have been sort of a scrubby landscape, much more open, sort of park-like, where you would have a pretty clear line of visibility. If we look at, historic accounts of people visiting the Squim Prairie, they describe it as an irregular space amounting to somewhat like 5 miles long by 3 miles wide. So you can get a sense that this was actually a relatively open landscape, and within this open Sequim-Dungeness landscape, you had these grasslands sort of spaced out within the broader prairie. If you pay attention, if you look at this map, you'll see I added this sort of cross on here, the orange and yellow cross, just to give you an idea of spatially where we're talking about. And so if you look at this next slide, and I know this is really grainy, but unfortunately aerial photography back in the 1940s isn't what it was today. But this is an aerial photograph looking at that same exact area I just had circled on the map. And you can see here that it was, even in the 1940s, you can still see the outlines of the Squim Prairies. You can see the riparian corridor following the Dungeness River north to south, where you've got more of a mature closed canopy forest with Douglas fir, western hemlock, lots of cottonwood and alder. You can see over on the east side, Bell Hill and Gearin Hill were almost entirely covered in Douglas fir forest. And then down between them, you have a cleared area where the Bell Creek drainage ran out to the east of Squim Bay, and then the Gearin Creek drainage to the north, heading out into the strait. To the west, and it's a little bit easier to see on the next slide, but at the far left end of this yellow line, you can see a cleared area. That's actually the Carlsberg Prairie, which is where Carlsberg is located today. Very similar to the Sporeseen Prairie in that they're on these remnant terraces that were actually once paleo channels of the Dungeness River. And what happened was it left behind this extremely gravelly, cobbly deposit. It was actually at the end of the last ice age, when the ice sheets retreated north, they just dumped tons of gravels and cobbles into the Sequim-Dungeness area. And that material is extremely well drained. And trees don't like extremely well drained soils. There's just not enough moisture. And so we see this in historic accounts when the first non-natives began to arrive in the Sequim-Dungeness area. What they described of the Squim Prairie from the summer and fall months was essentially just dead, brown, almost bare earth with some cactus and other plants growing on it. During our dry season, there was just no moisture held on that prairie, which is why we have this really unique ecotype with these rain shadow plants and things like prickly pear cactus and other plant species that are more similar to what you would see in eastern Washington and east of the Cascades. So this is looking at it from a different angle from the north. And this is looking at James Swan's account from 1861. He described the Squim Prairie or bottomland extending from Squim Bay in a northwesterly direction, some 10 miles, terminating at the bluff that's now roughly where Voice of America Park is, and the Dungeness Bluffs to the west of that. The width of the prairie varies from 2 to 7 miles, and perhaps 1/2 of the whole of this area is open grassland. And so this is actually, this slide and a lot of this that I'm reciting right now is actually building on the work of a gentleman named Dave Peter, who's an ecologist for the U.S. Forest Service, and has worked with another gentleman named Stan Graham, who have done some extensive research and documenting of Olympic Peninsula prairies. And you can see by these calculations that if you were to calculate by the GLO survey, so again, the yellow outlined areas of what they were calling prairies, that only constitutes about 12% of the total area that James Swan and other historic sources were citing as the broader Squim Prairie, which actually came out to over 20,000 acres of open land, which here in Western Washington is actually very rare. And this gets back into climatology and meteorological sciences, but at the end of the last ice age, roughly 13 to 12,000 years ago, Western Washington entered a period of much warmer and drier climate than we have today. And so from roughly 11 to 10,000 years ago until about 6,000 years ago, most of Western Washington was a relatively open park-like landscape, like I was just describing, with groves of Gary oaks maybe some spruce, white pine, and fir mixed in, but relatively open grasslands with large numbers of terrestrial mammals roaming around. And we know archaeologically and from tribal oral history sources at that time, people were primarily in pretty small groups. They were highly nomadic, moving around the landscape, following those large terrestrial mammals. Around 6,000 years ago, the climate here in Western Washington started to shift. It got colder and it got wetter. And so we see this in the pollen record with the spread of Western red cedar, which really likes to have wet roots, doesn't like to live out in drier climates. We start to see a proliferation of Western red cedar across Western Washington, British Columbia, from roughly 6,500 to 4,000 years ago. We see this mirrored in the archaeological record with the development of new and more woodworking technologies, specifically those centered around the use of Western red cedar. It also, people started to shift from hunting, primarily hunting large terrestrial mammals, to more of a marine-centric lifestyle, fishing for salmon, hunting marine mammals, harvesting shellfish, sort of what we conceive as sort of the prototypical Coast Salish or Northwest native lifestyle that was more centered around the ocean and marine resources. That just sort of came about or developed over the last 5,000 years. But in certain areas, like in the Olympic Peninsula rain shadow, down at the south end of Puget Sound, up on the San Juan Islands, you did have these areas where these prairies remained. And that wasn't just a climate factor, but that was because the tribes were out on the landscape actively using fire to manage the landscape. And I'm going to go more into detail with this in a couple slides. But the use of fire is incredibly important in stopping that forest succession cycle. And so that's essentially the only way that you stop the forest canopy from closing in like it has done over the rest of Western Washington. And anthropogenic burning, which is what we call that practice, that's the only reason why you have prairies out on the west end, like the Ozette Prairies, was because you had the Ozette and Makah and other West End tribes out there actively burning those prairies every couple years to stop those forests from closing in. You don't get natural wildfires very often out on the West End, and when you do get them, they don't burn for very long and they don't burn a very large area. So it's incredibly important to have humans on the landscape performing those traditions in order to keep this landscape the way that it has been for the last 10,000 years. So what I tried to do in this map is sort of break out those different prairies into subtypes. And this is not any sort of official ecological nomenclature or anything like that, but just gives you an idea of some of the different uses for those prairies. So when we say, oh, there were roughly 10 prairies around Squim, they weren't all the same. They had different plants growing on them. They were inhabited by different animals, and they were used by the Squalum and their ancestors for different purposes. If you look in the sort of the center of this map, you'll see a bright blue circle circling the Squim Prairie, the Sporeseen Prairie, and the Carlsberg Prairie. As I mentioned earlier, those prairies are sitting on top of very gravelly sandy loam or gravelly sandy loam, extremely well-drained soils that don't hold moisture very well. It's just not great soil for growing crops. And so those would have primarily been used as hunting prairies, especially what we call the Squim Prairie, which is the largest prairie and was a little over 300 acres. We actually have the Squim bypass site as a hunting camp at the very south end of that prairie on a terrace about 20 feet up, right about where the Squim Avenue and Highway 101 interchanges today. And that hunting camp was occupied for at least the last 6,000 to 7,000 years up until about 170 years ago, would have been used traditionally probably by a single family or maybe a small group of families who would come back every year. The men would hunt, the women would gather plant and foodstuffs. and then they would return in wintertime back to the village site at Sequim-Dungeness. And it was essentially a hunting park. You had a really open landscape. Once the shrubs or saplings started to grow in, again, you would use fire to open that landscape back up. But you could sit on top of that terrace and see these massive herds of deer and elk that we have attested in historic sources roaming over the landscape, and know how to go out, how to hunt those. And then, after hunting the animal, it wasn't just used for meat. Every single part of the deer and the elk was used. Everything from the antlers being used to create antler wedges, harpoons, and other tools. The sinews were harvested and used for hafting points like knife blades or arrows onto a handle or a shaft. The sinews were basically used how we use thread today in terms of making clothing, that sort of stuff. The hide itself was used to make a form of clothing, or for the men, actually a form of armor that they would wear during wartime, was multiple layers of elk hide overlapped. So shifting to the north, the prairies that you see circled with the green dotted line, you'll notice that those prairies, they're on different soils. They're on sandy loams, silty loams. Those were the camas gardens. Those were the prairies where women went out and dug camas roots, lily roots, fern roots. We'll go more into detail on these too, but those prairies actually held moisture throughout the year. Camas actually prefers to have a wetter environment to grow in. So that's not to say that there wasn't camas on those drier prairies to the south, but it just wouldn't have proliferated well enough to actually have a really successful harvest. Finally, circled in the dotted pink line, you'll see along the coast. In this map, they've classified them as beaches, but we actually have these coastal prairies on sand spits here around the Sequim-Dungeness area. And our beach or coastal prairies are actually some of the most intact prairies that we still have around our area, simply because we don't have much development going on sand spits. For obvious reasons, it's not a great place to build a house. So I'm going to go through these different prairies and talk about the different resources that were important on them, and how and why people would have moved around to different areas. So the camas gardens are amazing. And I use the term camas garden rather than prairie because these were quite intentionally managed by Squam women. So I mentioned fire earlier, and using fire. Usually in terms of camas garden, fire was applied every 2 to 3 years. Does a couple different things. The biggest, as I mentioned earlier, stops that forest succession cycle, clears any small Douglas fir saplings, baby oak trees, other small trees, and shrubs off the landscape. It also returns a lot of the carbon and other nutrients that are in those plants to the soil to encourage a better regrowth the next year. Gets rid of a lot of the thatch that would build up otherwise and start to crowd out some of our native prairie plants. Here in the Pacific Northwest, our native prairie plants tend to grow as bunch plants. And so if you would go back 200 years in time and transport yourself to one of these prairies, what you would see is bunches of camas and bunches of tiger lilies and bunches of bracken fern kind of growing in patches, with clear areas in between covered with moss. And so what we see today on the prairies in terms of the turf matting that's occurred and sort of grass everywhere and lots of thatch, that's all come as a result of the introduction of non-native pasture grasses, with farmers and the introduction of livestock, specifically, cows, sheep, goats, pigs, over the last 150 years. Once those pasture grasses were introduced, they proliferate at a much faster rate than our native prairie plants do. And once they start building up that thatch level, it actually crowds out our native prairie plants. Some of the ones that I have highlighted here, Camas in the top left, poi, incredibly important food resource, was actually the second most traded um, economic item for the Squam next to dried salmon. And camas would have been traded to, especially to tribes farther to the north. The natural range of camas growth essentially terminates right around Vancouver, BC, about a third way up Vancouver Island. So we're almost to the north end of the range of camas. So to tribes farther to north out of the range of camas, it was a highly desired food item. So tribes from down here on the Salish Sea would actually gather camas, and whatever wasn't preserved for winter time or eaten immediately was actually stored and then sent north and traded for other items that weren't available in this area. Camas is a wild lily, and it has a root, a bulb, very similar to a small onion. A full-size large camas bulb wouldn't be much bigger than the last knuckle on your thumb. So in a sense, not a very big bulb, but the reason it's so important for the Squam and other Coast Salish is an incredibly starch-rich, carbohydrate-rich plant food that you can put. What they would traditionally do is dig a pit in the ground. You would line that pit with some sort of vegetative material like skunk cabbage leaves or seaweed or kelp. And then you would put your camas bulbs on top of that. You would cover the pit up and you would roast that camas. Some camas roasts take up to 2 or 3 days, so a really long, extensive process. Then you would uncover the pit, and that camas essentially cooks down into almost like a syrupy type of very thick molasses porridge, has actually a sweet taste to it. That can then be dried out almost into like a brick that can be stored for winter when you don't have access to those carbohydrate and starch-rich, sugar-rich foods. You can rehydrate it, mix it with something like salmon grease, seal grease, or another fatty food. And that was sort of your traditional meal in the middle of winter that would provide all of those nutrients that wouldn't be accessible if you were trying to walk around in the middle of the winter and gather plants. Bottom left image is bracken fern, which was another incredibly important food resource. Bracken fern has these really, really long rhizomes that'll grow out 20, 30 feet or more. And it likes to grow in sandy soil, so it's usually pretty easy to dig up where you can find it. The women would go out using the same exact ironwood digging pole that you would use for digging camas and digging clams, you would use for digging the bracken fern roots. And once you start prying up one end of that rhizome, you can keep pulling, and the women would just pull that up and roll it up almost like a big rope, throw it over your shoulder, take it back to the village, and you can chop that root up and you can throw it on the fire and roast it whole like that, then scrape the skin off and eat the starch-rich material that's in the middle. Another approach was actually to roast it and then to pound it down into a type of flour and essentially make flatbread out of it, or flat cakes out of it. So again, another starch-rich, important food source for midwinter lean months. In the top right corner of this screen, you'll see a picture of Hooker's onion, which is one of our 2 or 3 native onion species. They don't get very big, but man, they pack a punch. You don't need a whole lot of our native onions to flavor your food, but that's exactly what they were used for. So you could pull up a couple of these little guys, throw it in with whatever you were cooking, and get a nice onion flavor. And the background image, if any of you ever have a chance to make it up to San Juan Island National Historic Park, absolutely splendid prairie remnants, intact remnant prairies there at the National Historic Park. And they're actually right now working closely with the Jamestown, as well as a couple other tribes, and restoring parts of that prairie, getting it back to better health. But I love this image because it gives you an idea of what those camas gardens would have looked like back in the day. Okay, so now I'm going to dive into a little bit about where they were digging these items up. So we're sort of zooming in on that broader map of the different prairies. The first one I want to feature is on the far left of your screen, actually located over right at what's today the Voice of America, and entrance to Dungeness National Wildlife Refuge, just west of Squim. In this account from Joe Johnson, who's a Jamestown Squam tribal ancestor from the Johnson family, he refers to it as Rogers Place. That's because at that time in the 1920s, there was a farmer there named Rogers, and so it was the Rogers family farm. But that prairie specifically was known as a place to gather bracken fern roots. And again, because it's on really sandy soils, it's a great place to go dig them up. It's pretty easy to dig them up. And there are still some pretty healthy patches of bracken fern out in that area, which is pretty cool to see. The next one that I'm going to talk about is Toponyms, which is located. It's actually in English, it's referenced as the Long Prairie, and you can see it sort of stretches along the Dungeness Bluff there on the south end of Dungeness Bay, and is closely associated with the two Squam village sites of Tsatsich and Seskat. Tsatsich being on Klein Spit and Seskat just to the east of the prairie overlooking the mouth of the Dungeness River. Again, another place where they went to gather roots. Mary Hunter Hall, Jamestown tribal ancestor from the Hall family. This is actually our only specific reference to camas around Squim. And Mary Hunter Hall told Erna Gunther, who is an ethnographer with University of Washington, who was out here in the 1920s interviewing Squam ancestors, that there originally was lots of camas on the prairies here long ago. The women would go out and dig all day long from sunrise to sunset, go out and dig for camas bulbs. And you can see from her account a whole day of work just for a little basket. But it was such a rich resource. It had such great nutritional value that it was worth spending all day out there digging it. And as I mentioned earlier, the traditional slalom cooking technique of baking it in a pit for 3 days and 3 nights in a pit lined with ferns and salal berries to cook it down and preserve it for late winter. So outside of those, say, prairie propers, the outlined areas that we're talking about that were sort of grassland, in that scrubby landscape in between, you had this amazing edible understory that was incredibly rich. And I'll go more into this in detail, but we're now, Western science is now finally coming around to that realization that the tribes in the Pacific Northwest absolutely did practice arboriculture. They were actively pruning these, they were actively moving these plants around the landscape. I'll talk a little bit more about the research that's been done on that in a couple slides. But thimbleberry, salmonberry, Pacific blackberry, salal, all eaten fresh. They were also, they would be mushed down, smoothed out, and essentially dried out into a type of fruit leather that could be preserved for late winter when you don't have many good sources of vitamin C. Oregon grape is an incredibly important medicinal plant. Soapberry, Shepherdea canadensis, is an important medicinal plant. And the berries themselves, the reason it gets the name soapberry, the berries contain saponin, which is the same chemical in soap that makes it all frothy. So if you take just a 1/4 cup of soapberry berries and whip them around, it actually froths up. And they would mix that with Pacific blackberry or another type of berry that's a bit sweeter. And that was what was called Indian ice cream, which is still a big treat with elders today. Important traditional food that I will give a caveat does not taste anything like American ice cream. So if you ever have a chance to eat it, just don't go in with the expectation that it's Haagen-Dazs. It definitely has a bitter taste to it, but a very, very cool plant that actually we know, looking at the pollen record, has been on our landscape since the Manus mastodon was killed. So 13,000 years ago, when the Manus mastodon was killed, some of these plants were on our landscape, including soapberry and our native prickly pear cactus. So some of these connections between peoples and plants going back over 10,000 years into the past. So extensive use and extensive knowledge and extensive history of connection and relationships there. Nuka rose, the rose hips are edible and were used in food, and also types of medicine. Blue elderberry is a very important medicine. Another important part, I mentioned the Gary oak groves a little bit. We have two very important edible nuts on our landscape. Gary oak acorns were harvested and actually eaten without any sort of processing other than removing the husk or the shell. And then hazelnuts, beaked hazelnuts are another very, very important food resource. And again, nuts are a great late winter food resource. You can go out and gather an entire basket of nuts, put that basket up on a shelf in the longhouse, and then come back to it in a couple months, and you've got an incredibly fatty and protein-rich food resource for late winter months. So moving a little bit to the east of where we were just talking about, some of the Squam toponyms and what they're referenced to. The beach between Jamestown and Dungeness itself refers to the fact that they would travel up and down the beach, and that was simply to avoid having to tromp through that massive wetland where Castleberry Creek drained out into the strait. Just to the west of that is the name of the area around the Dungeness River, and actually the name of the Dungeness River itself in Squam. And it's a little bit ironic because Squam actually means muddy, and we all know that the Dungeness River is not a very muddy river, but it's actually referring to the massive mud banks at the mouth of the river. You had the Squam and their ancestors living there at the mouth of the river for thousands of years, and over time depositing what archaeologists now refer to as shell midden, which is all of the materials, left over, shellfish shells, discarded tools, other waste, building up over time and creating these sort of shell heaps and mud heaps along the banks of the river there. We'll keep moving along. So one other note about Tsuk is there were duck pools located at the base of the Dungeness Spit, right at the narrow valley where the Dungeness River sort of comes through the ridge where the old Dungeness schoolhouse is today. And then down farther south on Gibson Spit around the Sequim village site, a Squam family would own rights to a pair of, it would be a pair of very large poles, usually anywhere from 40 to 50 feet tall or higher. And these were braced. And then during our annual winter waterfowl migrations, the family would have a massive net that was actually twined out of nettle fiber. And these nets would measure anywhere from 40 feet across, 40 feet tall to 100 feet across. And they would pull these nets up between the posts and then scare the waterfowl up off the water. The ducks would fly into the nets, they would drop the nets, and then you would have a couple hundred or a couple thousand ducks that you can then pluck, smoke, and preserve for winter. And the name of those duck nets was called Toponyms. So the coastal spit prairies that I mentioned earlier, we have a plant, sculpts, which is, they called it Indian carrot. It is a species of wild carrot. However, as some of you may notice just by looking at this image, it is extremely, extremely similar to our non-native invasive poison hemlock, which is extremely, extremely poisonous. Many of you probably know the story of Socrates, and he took hemlock to commit suicide. It is extremely dangerous poison. So this is the one that I'm the most cautious about. Please do not go out and try and harvest wild carrot. There are too many plants on our landscape that look extremely similar because they're very closely related, but are very poisonous. So just avoid trying to harvest that in general. But it is still out there on our landscape unless you have a specimen growing right next to poison hemlock. It is almost impossible to tell them apart. Over on the right side of your screen, Lomatium nudicale, both an incredibly important food resource and an incredibly important medicine for the squalum. Another name for this plant is Indian consumption plant because it was used to treat tuberculosis when the tuberculosis epidemics were happening in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Another name is bare stem biscuit root, and there's actually a number of biscuit root species in Washington state, but the reason they're called biscuit root, again, the root is very starch and carbohydrate rich. And what a lot of tribes do when they harvest it traditionally is you would bake it, then pound it out into a type of flour and then cook biscuits or flatbread with it. Here, as far as I know, the squalum traditionally just roasted the root whole and ate it in that sort of a fashion. And it's got a really interesting, strong celery taste to it. So it smells like celery. And then when you eat the root, it tastes like roasted celery. It's actually pretty delicious. So just a couple more of the toponyms as we're moving east. So you can see the extensive wetland at what's now Grayesmars Chatyum was a wetland that was actually, the name was related to seagulls and probably relates to harvesting seagulls at that location or possibly seagull eggs. Speltzen is the Squim Prairie, and that's more of a generic term that means sort of an open place or a meeting place, versus Sequim, which is the name of the village at Washington Harbor, which translates in Squam to a good place to hunt or shoot. And that could be a reference both to the Squim Prairie, where we know that individuals from this village site were hunting deer and elk and other mammals for the last couple thousand years, or it could be a reference to the Sequim-Dungeness on the spit there at the village site, or possibly a reference to both. I'm not sure. One of the really cool things that we have, the Squim Prairies have been incredibly developed and impacted by historic development in agriculture. So it's really hard to get an idea of what was once there just by looking at the Squim Prairies today. So what we have to do is take a step back, look at these different tribal sources that I've just gone through. And then we actually have a couple good non-tribal sources that were academics or citizen scientists who were out here in the early 1900s, botanists who were out collecting plants on our landscape and then actually submitting those to the Burke Herbarium over in Seattle. And I was able to actually go through those plant lists that were submitted from these individuals, and basically, we use a pun, weed out the plants that are specific to dry prairie or prairie ecology around Squim. And this actually gives us a really good idea of what was once present on the Squim Prairies. And I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but we do still see Menzies larkspur in very small populations in remnant prairies out on the spits on Dungeness Bay, farther west on the Olympic Peninsula. Kinnikinnick is still pretty common across the Olympic Peninsula. Farewell to Spring was once everywhere. Now there's pockets of it hanging out. I know there's some out on Protection Island and others in our area. Oh, sorry, I mean to go. Rewind. Some of these other ones, Spreading Dogbane, Henderson's Checker Mellow, we just don't, or I haven't seen on any of the Squim Prairies as of late. There's a good chance that they're not around anymore. Scholar's Catchfly, there's still some of that around. The plant list over on the left side of your screen was done by the ecologist Dave Peters from the U.S. Forest Service that I mentioned earlier, who did a plant survey on the Sporeseen Prairie in Squim in 2018, and found checker lily, a couple different species of lomatium, western buttercup, and house tritelia. And these photos are from the Sporeseen Prairie, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Sporeseen Prairie in a few slides. So I'll move on. George Neville Jones, another early botanist who was out collecting on the Squim Prairie in the 1930s. George Neville Jones gives us our first recorded historic reference to Opuntia fragilis, our native prickly pear cactus that grows in Squim. There's some over on Discovery Bay, and then over on Whidbey Island and San Juan Island are some small populations still hanging on. Smallhead clover, California tea, again spreading dogbane and Menzies fiddleneck, Pacific lupin, which can still be found pretty frequently in our area. And Oregon sunshine is another one that I have not seen around, but that doesn't mean that it's not there. So just to take a minute to talk about wetlands, because we talk so much about the Squim Prairies, the Olympic rain shadow, that it's really easy to overlook the fact that there were originally at least 14 rather large wetlands in the Sequim-Dungeness area, and that both the Castleary and Gearin Creek drainages, or the wetlands that drained those creeks, both had wetlands that were over 270 acres. And, for a total of just roughly calculating, at least 1,000 acres of wetlands around the Sequim-Dungeness area, which anywhere you look with indigenous cultures, anywhere, wetlands are incredibly important resources, exponentially important when you're in the rain shadow of the Olympic Mountains in an area where you receive 16 inches of rain or less per year. Areas where you have water resources year-round, incredibly important, not just for people, but for wildlife as well. And so looking at this map, you can get an idea that similar to the prairies, there were actually a couple different types of wetlands. You had sort of marshy drainages right at the outlets of the Gearin, Castleary, and Bell Creek creek channels, as well as a large wetland at the mouth of the Dungeness River. And then you had sort of boggy, less well-drained wetlands, like the circle you can see in the top left side of your screen, which is an area just south of Hogback and Lots Jessel Road. And it is still today a very marshy wetland area that's very poorly drained. Those would have been a little bit different ecotypes than the marshes that were draining the creeks. So in those creek drainages where you've got water slowly moving across the landscape, you would have had plants like skunk cabbage, which was an important food source during lean times or emergency times. You can eat skunk cabbage. It wasn't a highly desired foodstuff, but the large leaves were used in the cooking pits that I mentioned earlier. Today, it's kind of funny today, when they do the Squalum annual Quincy picnic and dig out the big traditional cook pit and put in all the shellfish. Today it's covered with newspaper. You can get an idea that back in the day when you didn't have newspaper available, skunk cabbage leaves, they're big, they've got a lot of surface area, so you can go out and gather a big armful of skunk cabbage leaves and cover your whole cooking pit with it. Bulrushes were used both for weaving, and then the pollen and the I'm not sure what the official term is, the puffs at the top of them had uses for medicinal uses, and then for making fire. Horsetail was an important late winter, early spring food resource. Wapato, we don't have this clearly documented in any of the Sequim-Dungeness wetlands. The closest that it's clearly documented in the scientific record is down around Shelton, Squaxin Island, Olympia area. But that's not to say that it wasn't present here, that the slalom wouldn't have traded for it or been aware. And Wapato was often referred to as an Indian potato. Again, the tuber would have been harvested and roasted much in a similar way to what I was explaining earlier. And finally, tule grass was an incredibly important tool resource. So tule was used for weaving large mats, mats for sitting on, mats for covering canoes, mats for covering tents, that sort of deal. Tule grass itself, a single piece of tule, you can cut it and it sort of creates a tube or a straw that was used in Indian medicine. So just another really important resource. And then differentiating from those and talking about the boggier, less well-drained or totally non-drained wetlands, would have formed more of a Labrador tea and cranberry bog ecotype. And Labrador tea is an incredibly important medicine for Coast Salish tribes, and cranberries, not an incredibly important food resource, simply because our native bog cranberry just doesn't produce enough berries to really create a whole meal, but it does have an incredibly strong flavor. And so, they would gather those cranberries and then mix them in with recipes for certain meals to add that flavor. These photos are from an intact cranberry bog over in the Chimacum area. So what happened to the prairies and what happened to the wetlands? The Sequim-Dungeness area was one of the earliest areas that was impacted by agricultural development around the Salish Sea. And one of the primary reasons for that was because we had such extensive prairies in this area. You had a relatively open landscape. That right off the bat makes it much easier for a farmer to come in, build a log cabin, put up a couple fences, and have an open farm without having to cut hundreds or thousands of large fir trees and other timber off of his property. And if you look at the map on the left side of the screen, the prairies are highlighted in dark orange, and then the earliest farms are actually the lighter orange blocks, and then the bright green squares are the farmhouses. You can see that those earliest farms were actually oriented around the edges of the prairies. And again, that's because those prairies were just so well drained. They were such gravelly soils that if you built your farm out in the middle of the Squim Prairie, nothing was going to grow there. Versus around the periphery of the prairie, where you've got a change in ecotone from prairie to shrubs to mature forest. You've got more vegetative material, a little bit better soils, you've got more shade. It's just a little bit easier area, a little bit easier to grow plants in those areas. Then sort of moving on to the image on the right side of your screen, it was the areas around the periphery of those prairies, those got filled up pretty fast with farms. And sort of the next step, which occurred in the 1890s, was the implementation or establishment of irrigation ditches around Squim to start bringing water from the Dungeness River into those drier prairies to make them better for agricultural pursuits. You can introduce the non-native pasture grasses, Timothy grass, orchard grass, reed canary grass, those sorts of things. But without irrigation, those non-native grasses do not do very well in essentially a desert prairie, which is what we had. So farmers started digging all of these irrigation ditches. And then you can also see the purple line. Actually, some of those canals actually drained some of those wetlands that I just referenced. And so probably the most extensive hydro modification to wetlands is what has occurred at Gearin Creek and what's today Grays Marsh Farms. There's still pockets of wetland there, but what was originally a 270 acre wetland is now reduced to maybe 30 or 40 acres at most, putting in drainage canals and ditches that pull the water off of the landscape and move it out into the strait much faster. So I mentioned the fire succession cycle earlier, and I don't want to spend too much time on this image, but you'll see here, and again, this is a slide from Dave Peter at the U.S. Forest Service, but he's specifically identified where, and he's got people in the two black areas, where humans interacting with the landscape using fire interrupts that long-term forest succession cycle. So here, as I mentioned, traditionally the women would go out and burn the prairie roughly every 2 to 3 years. If you do that, burning every 3 years, it stops that prairie proceeding into the sapling. Well, first what you would get is the herbs, shrubs, and tree seedlings. Within 10 years, you start to get sapling, Douglas fir, and oak forest. What you now see around lots of Squim is we're moving from sapling Douglas fir forest into mature closed Douglas fir forest, because that fire succession model has been interrupted now for about 150 years. The other result of this is a massive buildup in fuel material on our forest floors along the west coast of the United States. And we're seeing the impacts of that in sort of the increase in these massive catastrophic fires up and down the west coast. It's not because catastrophic fires didn't occur in the past. They did pretty regularly around every 300 to 500 years. And actually the last massive catastrophic fire that we had on the Olympic Peninsula occurred right around the time of the Great Cascadia earthquake around 1700. Within a few years of that, and may somehow in some way be related, that these catastrophic fires do occur, but in the past they've occurred very regularly, and essentially during those catastrophic fires they burn all of that fuel material off of the forest floor. Now that we've interrupted that cycle for the better part of 2 centuries, we have more fuel in terms of dead wood, debris built up on the floors of our forests than there's possibly been for thousands of years. So when we talk about why it's incredibly important for humans and fire to be part of forest management and landscape management, it's because if we don't use fire as a tool, that's when it becomes dangerous. That's when we get these overwhelmingly massive catastrophic fires. So I'm going to jump off that soapbox now. Another really, really great report that came out just last year from researchers and academics at Simon Fraser University and University of British Columbia up in BC was this great paper on historical Indigenous land use explains plant functional trait diversity. To sum that up in easier terminology, what they did was they compared, they went out, they looked at patches of forest that sort of just natural forest that were upland forest removed from any sites of human habitation, examined the ecology, what plant species were there, what sort of plant foods, medicinal foods were within that patch. Then they also examined the same size area around old Coast Salish village sites. And what they found was around these old village sites, you still had these intact forest garden ecosystems. And their conclusion was that forests managed by Indigenous peoples in the past now provide diverse resources and habitat for animals and other pollinators and are more rich than naturally forested ecosystems. And this is speaking specifically to forests, but the reason why I have this slide is because the same thing is absolutely true for prairies. And so I think we're at the beginning of a shift in re-examining what agriculture is and what arboriculture is. And, looking beyond the Western understanding of agriculture, that the tribes here in the Pacific Northwest and the Squam and their ancestors absolutely were practicing a less labor intensive form of agriculture than what we see in Europe, in the Middle East, and Asia. So yeah, I would, any of you who have a chance or an interest, I would highly encourage you to look up this paper and check it out. It's a very, very interesting read. One of the interesting things, and I'm not going to give away the exact location, but the image in the background of this screen is a prairie here on the northeast corner of the Olympic Peninsula up in the foothills, where we essentially have a massive remnant grove of not just huckleberries, but crabapple trees, other berry plants. It's essentially a remnant orchard around an old prairie up in the mountains where it hasn't been developed. So these places are still out there. They're still used by the tribe. Their locations are protected for the obvious reason that the minute that location is out there, a bunch of people go trampling around and it really damages the resource. But the tribe does work closely with the U.S. Forest Service, Olympic National Park, and other federal and state entities to protect those locations and try and get them restored to as much of a natural state as possible. So I wanted to highlight some of the other work that's been going on locally. The Jamestown Traditional Foods and Culture Program has been leading an effort to restore a patch of native prairie at the Dungeness River Center. In these images in the top part of your screen, you can see top left blue lupin, the center is farewell to spring. In the right image, it's kind of hard to tell, but it's blue wild rye, which is one of our just absolutely beautiful native prairie grasses, bunch grasses that grew here. And I mentioned the Sporeseen Prairie earlier. So the Sporeseen Prairie is about 50% developed into suburban neighborhood at this point. We've got a remnant patch of about, I think it's 7.5 acres of the Sporeseen Prairie that are slated to be developed into a neighborhood later this year. So over the past year and a half, we've worked closely, the tribe has worked closely with the developers of that property. And we also were assisted by the North Olympic Land Trust. We created a plan to identify and try and salvage as many of the native prairie plants from that property prior to the development occurring. So what we did this past spring and summer, I spent a couple months wandering around with the little pink survey flags that you can see in some of these pictures, flagging where these different prairie plants were located. And then we waited until fall for when those plants enter their dormant cycle, when the rainy season restarts. And we went out and dug up a pretty substantial number of chocolate lily, the house tritelia that I mentioned earlier. We've got some of the lomatium species that I mentioned earlier, the biscuit root species. We went out, dug them up essentially in sort of sod turves, tossed those on a pallet in the back of my pickup truck, took them over to the Dungeness River Center. And you can see in the image on the bottom right side of your screen is where we have settled those guys in at that restoration project. And actually, you can see the fences on the left side of that picture. That's the Olympic Discovery Trail. So if you're on the Olympic Discovery Trail in Squim, and you're headed from Priest Road west towards the Dungeness River, right before you get to the Dungeness River Center, there's a field on the north side to your right. That's the Prairie Restoration Project. So anytime any of you guys are out on the Olympic Discovery Trail, just take a look over the fence. You'll see the circles of mulch that we put around the prairie plants. We're trying to stop some of the non-native pasture grasses from encroaching on them. And keep an eye on that. We're not sure What exactly is going to pop up this spring? You know, these perennials usually need a full year to kind of naturally reset before they go back into reproduction mode. So not sure if we'll get much of a bloom of the chocolate lilies and other prairie plants this coming year, but we're hoping, you know, 2-3 more years down the line, that we've at least salvaged enough of these plants to preserve the genetic diversity in this area, preserve plants that are specifically evolved to naturally succeed in Squim with our climate and our microclimates. So just, it was a really, really cool project. It was great to participate in that. And stay tuned, both you can stay tuned on Facebook with the Jamestown Tribe or their Traditional Foods and Culture program, or with the Dungeness River Center, because there will be future opportunities for more volunteer work. And this is a very long scale project. You know, these prairie restorations don't happen overnight. And this is something that we're looking at continuing over hopefully the next 5 to 10 years, in the goal of eventually, maybe a decade from now, being able to take out a tribal group to do a traditional camas dig there at the Dungeness River Center. Would be really, really amazing. On the left side of your screen, this is Mackenzie Brunell from the Jamestown Traditional Foods and Culture program, doing a traditional harvest of lomatium out on Spit and Squim Bay. Top middle image is a cedar bark gathering trip with tribal elders over to Indian Island a couple years ago. And then the top right image is a group from the Jamestown tribe at the Port Townsend Katai Prairie with Forrest Schomer, who's part of the Friends of the Katai Prairie, and he's also, along with Fred Sharp, founded the Olympic Peninsula Prairies nonprofit. For those of you interested, I highly encourage you to check out their work. Forrest was kind enough to invite the tribe over to do a small camas dig there at the Katai Prairie, which was a very educational experience in exactly how fun it is to try and dig anything out of our soils in mid-August. It's a lot like hacking at concrete, which just gives you all the more appreciation for the fact that women were out there doing it a 12-hour day with just an ironwood digging stick. So I'm gonna wrap up there, and we'll take some questions. As I mentioned earlier, for any of you interested in learning more about what we're talking about today, I highly encourage you to check out the Jamestown Tribal Library's website, library.jamestowntribe.org, where you can find information about more programs like this, as well as research resources. Tribalmuseum.jamestowntribe.org is the Jamestown Tribe's House of Seven Generations online museum. Another great resource. Lots of great historic photographs, documents, oral history recordings, that sort of stuff. As I mentioned earlier, these presentations are all being recorded and put on the Jamestown Tribal Library YouTube page at youtube.com/JSTlibrary. And then we're also here at the North Olympic History Center. We're currently working on a couple different projects that we're really excited to get underway this year. The North Olympic History Center is a 501c3 nonprofit. We are always looking for new members and new volunteers. We've got lots of exciting opportunities coming up, so please check out our website, northolympichistory.org, or like us on our Facebook page, facebook.com/North Olympic History Center. You can stay tuned on those for upcoming events and programs.